The Story of Machaon, Book 1, The Serpent and the Staff. Asclepius, Machaon's father, is often depicted holding a staff with a serpent coiled around it, symbolizing healing and rebirth. In the Thessalian town of Tricca, where the first and most ancient temple of Asclepius stood, young Machaon grew up under the gaze of this very symbol. Every day he watched pilgrims limping through the temple's columned courtyard, seeking cures for their ills. His father, Asclepius, was no ordinary physician, but a demigod, son of Apollo, and worshipped as the patron of medicine for centuries. His mother, Epione, lived up to her gentle name. She was the personification of the care that eases pain. Together, in the fragrant sanctuary at Tricca, they raised a most unusual family of healers. Machaon was one of 7 children, each, it seemed, born with a tincture of healing in their veins. He and his brother Podalirius were the only boys, both mortal but deeply gifted, destined to become physicians themselves. Their sisters bore names that practically shouted their roles to the world: Hygeia, goddess of health and cleanliness; Panacea, meaning all healing, a universal remedy made flesh; Iaso, the goddess of recovery from illness; Achiso, personification of the process of healing. Little wonder that even the Hippocratic Oath, sworn by physicians centuries later, begins by invoking Apollo the physician, and Asclepius, and Hygeia and Panacea, among other deities. In this household, medicine wasn't just a profession. It was the family business and a sacred calling. If the girls embodied the ideals of health, the 2 boys learned to practice the art. Podalirius, observant and thoughtful, had a knack for diagnosis. He could look at a villager's pallor and predict a fever before the first shiver. Ancient storytellers would say Podalirius became the archetype of the internist, a master of identifying internal ailments and even easing troubled minds. Machaon, by contrast, was drawn to action. From a young age he showed steady hands and steady nerves, unflinching at the sight of blood. His very name hinted at his destiny. Derived from mache, the Greek word for battle, Machaon meant something like the warrior, or even the one who fights and heals, an uncannily perfect name for a combat medic. In the healing sanctuary at Tricca, childhood was anything but ordinary. While other boys learned to fish or hunt, Machaon learned how to mix salves and splint broken bones. He scampered not after stray sheep, but after sacred snakes that coiled in the temple corridors. These serpents, harmless Aesculapian snakes, were allowed to slither freely where the sick slept, as they were believed to carry the gods' healing power. Many nights, young Machaon helped his mother Epione scatter clean bedding in the abaton, the innermost dormitory of the temple, where patients lay dreaming of Asclepius. By lamplight, he'd glimpse the sinuous form of a snake gliding over a patient's feet. Instead of shrieking, Machaon watched in fascination. His sister Hygeia even tamed one old snake to eat from her bowl of herbs, a scene so iconic that statues of Hygeia often show her feeding a serpent. The boy learned early that nature itself was an ally in healing, whether in the form of a snake, a soothing spring, or a humble plant. This reverence for nature's remedies would define his life. Despite their divine lineage, the family was warm and surprisingly down to earth. Asclepius, though a demigod, wore a kindly smile beneath his thick beard and insisted on being called father rather than lord at home. In the mornings, he would tousle Machaon's dark curls and allow him to watch minor treatments. "Observe, then do," he'd say. Machaon took this to heart. He watched Epione calm a screaming child by blowing cool air on a burn and humming a lullaby. He watched Hygeia scrub her hands and instruments fastidiously with boiled water and ash, her insistence on cleanliness clearly the origin of hygiene itself. He listened to Panacea's playful theories that one miraculous herb in her garden might cure any disease, to which Podalirius would roll his eyes and quip, "Keep dreaming, sister. There's no panacea for all ills." In the evenings around the hearth, the siblings would quiz each other on medicinal lore. It was a lively upbringing. One moment little Iaso was bandaging her doll's wounds. The next, Podalirius was lecturing on the humors of the body, while Machaon might be using that doll to practice knotting surgical stitches. In this nurturing chaos, Machaon's vocation took root as naturally as a wild herb on a hillside. Machaon's education formally began the day he was tall enough to see over the edge of the operating table. Asclepius draped him in a clean linen apron. "There's no shame in a blood-stained apron, my boy, but it must start clean," his father noted wryly, and allowed him to assist in basic tasks. They started small, grinding dried plants with mortar and pestle to make poultices, boiling wine with myrrh for washing wounds, collecting spiderwebs to pack into cuts. Machaon learned to identify dozens of healing herbs by sight and smell. Willow bark for pain relief was one of the first. He could recognize the tree's silvery leaves down by the river. Asclepius taught him to strip the bark and brew it into a bitter tea to ease aches and fevers, a remedy that the great physician Hippocrates himself would recommend centuries later. Another favorite in their pharmacopoeia was yarrow, a common wildflower with feathery leaves. Achilles' plant, Asclepius called it with a grin, handing Machaon a tuft of the pungent herb. According to legend, the warrior Achilles had carried yarrow with him to treat his soldiers' battle wounds, and indeed the plant's Greek name, Achillea, honors that tale. Machaon discovered why. When crushed and applied, yarrow stanched bleeding remarkably well. He saw it turn gushing blood into an ooze, an effect so consistent that Greek healers had used it since time immemorial to stop wounds from hemorrhaging. The boy took pride in mastering these remedies. By the age of 10, he could concoct a poultice for a nasty gash, as confidently as other kids his age might shoot a sling stone. Yet it wasn't all herbs and tonics. Asclepius knew that a true physician must handle the knife as well as the mortar. Under his father's watchful eye, Machaon learned anatomy, not from books, but from life. They dissected fish and birds from the market to understand muscles and tendons. Once, when a farmer's goat died giving birth, Asclepius took the opportunity to show his son the position of the organs inside, the lungs like pink sponges, the liver dark and rich with blood. Epione stayed Machaon's trembling hand and guided it to feel the goat's heart, now still. "Remember, every creature's life is sacred," she murmured, "and every body teaches us something." Machaon nodded solemnly. He noticed his father's eyes shining with pride at Epione's gentle lesson. The youth's skill grew in leaps and bounds. By adolescence, Machaon was effectively an assistant surgeon in the temple. He had learned to remove embedded arrows from flesh smoothly and quickly, cutting along the entry wound and plucking out the barbed point with minimal damage. "Like removing a thorn from a lion's paw," Asclepius joked the first time Machaon succeeded in extracting an arrow from a patient's shoulder. After removal, Machaon knew exactly what to do. Cleanse the wound with wine, then pack it with soft herbs and compresses. Machaon became adept at bandaging, wrapping strips of linen snugly to protect injuries. He practiced cauterization too, carefully searing bleeding vessels with a hot iron when needed to stop hemorrhage. His hands, large and strong, proved surprisingly deft. Whether stitching a gash with fine thread or fashioning a makeshift splint from reeds and cloth, he worked with calm precision. Those who watched him at work often remarked that Apollo's healing light clearly shone on the boy. Asclepius also shared esoteric knowledge with his son, wisdom passed down from the centaur Chiron, who had mentored Asclepius in his youth. On a summer journey to Mount Pelion, the pine-forested peak where Chiron's cave was said to lie, Asclepius recounted tales of his own training. The wise centaur had taught him which plants could kill and which could cure, how the same flower that soothes a cough might, in a larger dose, still a heart. Machaon was wide-eyed at the thought of his formidable father as a student himself, trotting behind a half-horse tutor. They even visited a mossy glen where Asclepius claimed Chiron once gathered rare herbs. There, father and son collected a few clippings of dittany and sage, plants rumored to have miraculous effects. "Chiron's gifts," Asclepius whispered as he packed them, referencing the legendary herbs given by Chiron that had aided many healers. Machaon felt a thrill. He was now heir to that ancient lineage of knowledge. In that moment, inhaling the sharp scent of sage on the Pelion breeze, he understood that medicine was not just science but also a bit of magic and myth, and he was part of it. Phycation and humility. On another occasion, Podalirius diagnosed a distraught woman with wandering womb, a common catch-all for hysterical symptoms, and prescribed calming herbs, only for Machaon to discover she had simply eaten some bad figs and needed a purge. The brothers bickered afterward, Podalirius insisting his diagnosis was also correct in a metaphorical sense. Asclepius settled it by gently pointing out that both the mind and body must be cared for, a holistic view his sons would carry forward. In time, the two brothers became a complementary team. Podalirius with his keen diagnostic intuition, and Machaon with his surgical daring and practical remedies. Between the two of us, we make one excellent physician, Podalirius joked. Machaon countered with a grin. I'll handle the cuts and bruises, you handle the fevers and phobias. It was in truth not far from how history would remember them. Podalirius as healer of internal ills, Machaon as the archetypal combat medic. One autumn afternoon when Machaon was about 17, a crisis struck that would prove the young healer's mettle. It began with shouts at the temple gate and the thundering of hooves. Machaon dropped the bundle of herbs he was sorting and dashed outside. A donkey cart driven at reckless speed was barreling into the courtyard. The cart hit a rut and lurched to a stop, nearly toppling. Two men hopped off, frantic. In the back lay a third man, ashen-faced and moaning, with a crude bandage wrapped around his thigh, dark with blood. Asclepius was away that day, summoned to a distant village, and Podalirius was out gathering mushrooms with a patient. No senior healer was present, only Machaon. The men recognized him and yelled for help. "He's hurt! A boar gored him! Please do something!" They pulled back the blood-soaked cloth to reveal a ghastly sight. A deep laceration in the man's upper leg, where a wild boar's tusk had torn through flesh. Blood oozed in alarming quantity. Machaon's stomach clenched at the metallic smell, but he fought down his fear. This, he realized, is what Father prepared me for. "Bring him in quickly," Machaon ordered, sounding far calmer than he felt. The two friends half-carried, half-dragged the wounded villager into the temple's treatment room. Machaon took a rapid inventory. The man, a farmer named Demas, he recalled, was semi-conscious and trembling. A nasty puncture wound gaped on the outer thigh, likely slashing the femoral muscle. Blood pulsed out with each sluggish heartbeat. If the femoral artery was fully severed, Demas would bleed to death within minutes. If only nicked, there was still no time to lose. Either way, Machaon knew the clock was ticking. He barked orders like a seasoned surgeon. "You, boil water and wine now. Fetch me clean linens, tear that tunic if you must, and bring my case of tools from that shelf." The men jumped to task. Epione, hearing the commotion, rushed in with the younger daughters. "Epione, I need your hands here," Machaon said. His mother nodded, eyes wide but steady, deferring to her son's lead without question. Hygeia hurried to stoke the hearth for boiling water, and Panacea ran to fetch her basket of herbs. In the corner, little Acheso and Iaso peeped in fearfully. Epione shooed them out to keep them from fainting at the gore. Machaon knelt by Demas. Bright red arterial blood was welling, not spurting in jets but flowing freely enough. He pressed his hand hard against the wound. The farmer groaned. "Hold on, Demas," Machaon murmured. "We'll take care of you." He was surprised at how calm his own voice sounded. Inside, his heart hammered. "Stop the bleeding." "That is the priority," his father's teachings rang in his head. Machaon grabbed a thick roll of clean linen that Epione had fetched. With firm, unhesitating motions, he packed the wound and had Epione press on it to stem the blood. The friend returned with Machaon's wooden case of bronze instruments, scalpels, forceps, probes, needles. Machaon swiftly washed his hands in the hot water Hygeia brought. She insisted, as always, on cleanliness. Wine was boiling with water. Good. He plucked a small vial of powdered yarrow from his case, dried and ground from the very plant Achilles had once used on the battlefield. "Thank you, old Achilles," he whispered, as he mixed the yarrow with a bit of water into a paste. Removing the soaked linen pad, he packed the pale green paste deep into the gash. Yarrow's astringent magic began working to staunch the hemorrhage. The bleeding lessened visibly within moments, clots forming where the herb contacted torn flesh. Now Machaon could inspect the damage. It was ugly. A puncture and rip about a hand's span long. The edges of the wound were ragged. Machaon's mind raced through options. Stitch it? Not yet. Not until it was thoroughly clean. Risk of infection was high with boar wounds. Boars carried dirt and who knows what on their tusks. He recalled an old hunter's saying, "Boar wounds fester worse than bears." He would have to cleanse it deeply. "Heat more water and wine," Machaon instructed. He took a deep breath. This next part would hurt, but unconsciousness spared Demas for now. With Epione's help, he flushed the wound with warm wine, pouring the diluted wine slowly into the gash and letting it wash out blood and debris. The sharp smell of wine filled the room. Dymas groaned and twitched as the liquid hit raw tissue, but did not wake. Machaon gently probed the depths with a sterile linen cloth. No obvious fragments of tusk or dirt remained, thank Apollo. The bleeding was much reduced now, oozing rather than spurting thanks to the yarrow and compression. Time to close this wound. Machaon threaded a curved needle with a length of clean gut. His fingers were steady. He was in a state of focused flow, almost an extension of all those practice sessions on pigskin and leather. With Epione holding a torch close for light, Machaon carefully sutured the muscle layers first, stitching internal tissues back together as best he could. Each stitch he placed with precision, the needle biting through flesh and emerging on the other side, his forceps tugging it along. When the muscle was approximated, he sutured the outer skin, leaving a small gap for drainage. The stitches were neat and firm. Machaon felt a small bloom of pride. It looked not so different from Asclepius's own handiwork. Now he spread a thick paste of herbs over the closed wound. He had asked Panacea to chew up some willow bark and mix it with honey and a bit of moldy barley bread. The willow would help with pain and inflammation, and honey would keep the wound moist and fend off infection. Over this he laid a fresh bandage of linen and tied it snugly. It was done. Dymas was alive, his wound cleaned and closed. The crisis had passed. Now came the waiting. Machaon finally exhaled and wiped sweat from his brow, noticing only now that he was drenched and his hands were trembling with adrenaline. Epione placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did well, my son," she said softly, her eyes full of tears, of relief and pride. The farmer's friends looked at Machaon with something akin to reverence. "You saved him," one whispered. Machaon shook his head modestly. "His fate is with the gods now. We've just done what we could." Still inside, he allowed himself a moment of triumph. His first solo emergency, and he had risen to the challenge. Over the next few hours, Dymas stabilized. They kept him warm and gave him willow bark tea when he stirred in pain. Podalirius returned and fussed that perhaps he should prepare a feverfew tonic to stave off fever. Machaon welcomed his brother's input, and together they watched for any signs of infection or shock. By dawn the next day, the farmer was awake, weak but lucid, and very grateful. When Asclepius finally returned to the temple and heard the tale, he embraced Machaon in the biggest bear hug of his life. "I am immensely proud of you," Asclepius said, eyes shining. For a moment Machaon thought he detected a glint of something else, perhaps a hint of sadness, in his father's expression, but it passed quickly. "You are ready, my son," the god of healing declared. Ready? For what? Machaon wasn't sure. But in Asclepius's tone lay a recognition that his apprentice had become a physician in his own right. That night there was a modest celebration. Machaon's sisters peppered him with questions about every step of the procedure, while Podalirius play-acted the scene with dramatic flair. Blood everywhere, and our hero Machaon doesn't even flinch. Amid the laughter and relief, Asclepius clapped a hand on Machaon's shoulder. "Today you carried the staff," he said, gesturing to the serpent-twined staff leaning in the corner. It was the very one Asclepius carried as a badge of his power. Machaon understood the symbolism and felt a swell in his chest. If the serpent and the staff were the emblem of his father's art, today Machaon had proven himself worthy of it. In the ensuing months, life returned to a pleasant routine at the temple, but fate was quietly turning. Asclepius had always walked a delicate line, a mortal healer wielding divine knowledge. The gods watched him with interest and perhaps with growing concern. The Olympians have never been fond of anyone usurping their prerogatives, least of all the final prerogative, death. And Asclepius, in his boundless compassion, was about to cross that line. Whispers reached Tricca of Asclepius attempting the unthinkable, resurrection. There were murmurs that a great king's son had died, and that Apollo himself begged Asclepius to intervene. Some spoke of Hippolytus, prince of Athens, who had been killed in a tragic accident, thrown from his chariot, and whose patron goddess Artemis could not bear to lose him. In these hushed tales, Asclepius found a way to bring the dead back to life, perhaps using a potent elixir or the mystical blood of the Gorgon Medusa, which Athena had once given him. Others said Asclepius had simply applied all his skill and a hefty dose of divine favor to recall the soul of Hippolytus from the underworld. and one particularly cynical rumor claimed Asclepius had accepted gold in exchange for this miracle, essentially bribing Hades by stealing back a soul. Whatever the exact cause, the outcome was the same. Zeus's wrath was ignited. The king of the gods, alarmed that a mortal, even a demigod, had learned to undo the finality of death, decided to enforce the natural order. Hades, lord of the underworld, was said to have protested vehemently. Asclepius was thinning out his kingdom of shades. Death, once decreed by the fates, was supposed to be irrevocable. If humans could simply be revived, what next? To Zeus, it was an intolerable violation of the sacred boundary between mortal and god. Machaon knew none of this cosmic deliberation, of course. All he knew was that one clear evening, as the family sat down to supper, Asclepius was called away urgently. A messenger in gleaming attire, was it a man or a god in disguise, delivered a request that the healer god travel to a distant land to tend to a matter of life and death. Asclepius kissed Epione and each of his children in turn. When he came to Machaon, he placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "Tend the temple while I'm gone, my boy," he said. "And remember, a good physician treats the patient, not just the disease." Machaon found this an odd thing to say as a parting line, but he nodded. He watched his father depart under the fading light of dusk, the serpent staff in hand, its bronze snakehead glinting. It would be the last time he saw Asclepius alive. What happened next reached Tricca in fragments, like pieces of a shattered vase. Some said Asclepius journeyed to the court of King Minos in Crete to revive the king's son. Others that he traveled to Athena's temple in Athens at Artemis's behest. Machaon had unsettling dreams in those days, of his father standing over a bier, golden light flowing from Asclepius's hands into a lifeless body, and a figure watching from the shadows with thunder in his eyes. Epione paced the halls, wringing her hands, worry etched on her brow without knowing exactly why. Then, one night, disaster struck. A violent storm gathered over Tricca with unnatural speed. The wind howled, thunderheads blackened the moon. The family huddled inside as lightning lanced across the sky. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash and a boom that shook the very foundations of the temple. The air smelled of ozone and something acrid. Machaon's heart dropped. That bolt had struck unnaturally close. He bolted upright, a dreadful premonition taking hold. Ignoring Epione's call, he dashed out into the rain. In the courtyard, a smoking crater marred the earth before the altar of Asclepius, and there, lifeless in the mud, lay the body of Asclepius, charred and still. A small gasp escaped Machaon's throat. He rushed to his father's side and fell to his knees. The rain sluiced down, washing soot from Asclepius's serene face. Machaon shook him, then felt for a pulse he knew he would not find. The truth was undeniable. Zeus had struck Asclepius down with a thunderbolt. The healer who could save anyone else had not saved himself. "No, no, father, please," Machaon choked. Epione and the others, hearing his cries, soon gathered, and their wails of grief rose with the wind. Epione clutched her husband's body, sobbing, "Asclepius, my love," while the daughters cried out in despair. Panacea collapsing to her knees, Hygeia pressing her forehead to her father's hand as if she could will warmth back into it. Podalirius stood frozen, disbelief in his eyes, whispering, "This cannot be." It was the darkest moment the family had ever known. As they brought Asclepius's body into the temple hall, a strange calm came over the weather. The storm passed as swiftly as it had come, as though its terrible purpose was fulfilled. Machaon's mind swirled with equal parts grief and fury. He understood now what must have happened. Asclepius had pushed the limits too far by resurrecting the dead, and Zeus, fearing mortal men might learn the secret of immortality, had intervened with deadly force. It was an awe-inspiring and terrifying reminder that no matter how skilled a healer might be, mortality was a law even demigods could not rewrite. Hades would accept no refunds on souls. Zeus would brook no challenge to divine order. Asclepius's transgression, born of compassion, had cost him his life. They laid Asclepius out on a bier in the temple. All night, worshippers and patients from near and far came to pay respects, lighting candles and burning incense. In their tear-streaked faces, one could see how beloved Asclepius was, not just as a godly figure, but as a kind healer who had touched many lives. Apollo himself, it was said, flew into a rage at the news of his son's death. Some whispered that Apollo avenged Asclepius by striking down the Cyclopes who forged Zeus's thunderbolts. But such tales were of little comfort to Machaon and his family in that moment. Towards dawn, as Machaon kept weary vigil by his father's body, he noticed something odd and wondrous. Two tiny points of light, like stars, twinkling on Asclepius's brow. They coalesced into the faint image of snakes entwining around his father's lifeless hands. Machaon rubbed his eyes. Was he hallucinating from sorrow and lack of sleep? But others saw it too, and a soft murmur spread through those present. The lights glowed, then drifted upward, slowly rising above the bier. Epione gasped. As the family watched in astonishment, the twin lights spiraled upward through the open oculus of the temple roof, joining the fading stars in the early morning sky. It was as if Asclepius's essence, the serpent and the staff, were being lifted to the heavens. In fact, legends say Zeus, moved by Apollo's pleas, placed Asclepius among the stars as the constellation Ophiuchus, the serpent holder. And truly, as Machaon gazed upward through tears, he felt that his father's spirit was not wholly gone. It had been immortalized in the firmament, a reminder that the art of healing is as eternal as the stars. In the days following Asclepius's tragic death, the family was inconsolable. They performed the funerary rites in a haze of disbelief. Machaon, his face set in stony grief, helped Podalirius and a cadre of loyal patients carry Asclepius's body to its rest. The mortal part of the god was buried with honor. Some say in the earth of Tricca, others that his remains were later moved to Epidaurus or Gerenia, where hero cults would spring up. The temple fell quiet without the familiar, confident footsteps of its master. At dusk, Machaon would catch himself straining to hear his father's voice, offering some gentle correction or friendly laugh, only to feel the ache of memory. It was a loss on a scale he'd never imagined. Yet even in grief, duty called. The sick and injured did not stop coming to the sanctuary. If anything, even more arrived, as word of Asclepius's martyrdom spread and drew those seeking solace at the shrine of the fallen healer. Machaon and Podalirius had to step up as the chief physicians now. Epione, despite her broken heart, continued to comfort and assist as she always did, soothing even when she herself was wounded by loss. The first time Machaon had to treat a patient after his father's death, his hands trembled. He felt a wave of doubt. Without father, can I do this? But then he remembered Asclepius's parting words. Treat the patient, not just the disease. He remembered how Asclepius had trusted him. A steely resolve formed within. One evening, shortly after the funeral, Machaon found himself alone in the temple's inner sanctum, standing before the great statue of Asclepius. In the flickering lamplight, the marble Asclepius looked calm, wise, and a little sad. At his side, carved in stone, was the familiar staff with the snake. Machaon reached out and touched the cool marble of the staff. So much had happened under the watch of that serpent and staff. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath of the incense-laden air. In that quiet moment, Machaon made a vow, an oath as solemn as any sworn by a warrior or king. He spoke softly, voice echoing against the high vaults. Father, hear me. Apollo, all gods of healing, hear me. I will carry on your work. I will heal whomever I can with all the skill and knowledge I possess. I will honor the gift of healing that runs in our blood. His fist tightened around the carved staff. But I swear I will never trespass beyond the boundary of mortality. I will not raise the dead, nor seek to make men immortal. I am a mortal healer, and I will remember my place. As he uttered these words, he felt a strange warmth on his shoulders, as if some unseen presence, perhaps Asclepius's hand, perhaps approval from Olympus, gently rested there. The snake carved around the staff seemed almost alive in the dancing shadows. Machaon opened his eyes, and for an instant he thought the marble lips of his father's statue curved in a hint of a smile. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, or perhaps Asclepius's spirit truly heard and was at peace with his son's promise. Machaon stepped back, heart lighter than it had been in days. He knew the road ahead would be hard. Wars and challenges loomed on the horizon. Already there were rumors that King Agamemnon was mustering Greek forces for an expedition to far-off Troy, a war that would demand the skills of every healer. But Machaon felt ready. He had inherited Asclepius's mantle, serpent staff and all, not in a literal sense. The gods had claimed the original after all. but in the sense that he now carried the family legacy forward. He would be the serpent holder in his own way, a healer who could stand in the midst of battle and chaos, bringing relief, yet always respecting the laws of life and death. Outside, under the night sky, the first stars blinked into view. Machaon looked up. High above, faint but distinct, a new constellation twinkled, a pattern of stars some would later call Ophiuchus, resembling a man holding a serpent. Machaon felt a swell of emotion. "Sleep well, father," he whispered. "You are among the stars now." Wiping a tear from his cheek, he turned and walked back into the torchlight where his brother and sisters were waiting. There was much work to do, and Machaon, son of Asclepius, would ensure that the light of healing did not falter. Both he has forged his guiding principles. Smart, warm, occasionally humorous and deeply human, Machaon will go on to fulfill his destiny as a healer in the trials to come, armed with his father's teachings, his own hard-won wisdom, and an oath in his heart as unbreakable as the staff of Asclepius itself. The serpent and the staff now pass to the next generation, and under their sign Machaon will heal, suffer, learn, and perhaps become a legend in his own right. But those stories lie ahead on distant battlefields beneath the walls of Troy, and will be told in due time. For now, in the quiet of Tricca, the young physician finds solace in his purpose. In honoring the mortal bounds of healing, Machaon paradoxically feels closer than ever to the divine spirit of his father. And with that feeling, he steps forward into the future, replacing the staff for a scythe, ready to serve humanity with the art and compassion, in peace or war, as a true son of Asclepius.